All right, guys, so I'm just going to give you a basic introduction into interest groups. All right, shouldn't take too long, just kind of an introduction before we get into a little bit more. Okay, so interest group is a formal and informal association of people seeking to influence governmental policy in favor of their interests. Interest groups may represent social causes, economic and corporate interests, or religious and ideological interests. Okay, so one of the things we're going to focus on is how they are different than political parties. Okay, so when you think interest groups, there's so many of them. Okay, ones that we'll talk about specifically to use as good examples would be things like the National Rifle Association, the American Association of Retired Professionals, the ARP, the NAACP. So there's many different interest groups that are out there. They work to try to influence the government just in a little different way than political parties generally do. Okay, so what is the purpose? They educate voters and office holders, they draft legislation, and they mobilize membership to apply pressure on pressure on and work with legislators and government agencies. Okay, they do this through you can see if you look up at that cartoon really closely, you can see they do this through things like lobbyists who work on behalf of an interest group to try to convince legislators and other policymakers to try to enact pieces of legislation that would benefit the interest of their group. So they're much more centered around that. That's what I'll pop through really quick, is look at the differences between the two. Okay, if I can find my slide. There we go. So differences between political parties and interest groups. Okay, so parties generally, parties nominate candidates, they run people for elections, and that's how they seek to influence the government, right? Is that they try to get people to win elections, to get put into those policy-making positions, to then, change policy that way, okay? In contrast, interest groups seek to try to influence, public officials and government employees who are already there to try to specifically enact policy that would benefit the members of their groups. Okay, so we were just mentioning this. Political parties take a stance on a wide range of public issues. Okay, whereas interest groups are they're much more focused on a narrow interest usually. Okay, that apply specifically to their members. Okay, so they are much more engaged in trying to influence policymakers and try to influence the legislation that's actually being passed, rather than just worrying about getting a candidate into that office. Okay, political parties are public organizations that are accountable to the voters, whereas interest groups are private organizations that are accountable to their membership base. Okay, we're gonna come back and we're gonna learn a little bit about this guy. He was a famous or infamous lobbyist, Jack Abramoff. But a lobbyist, again, this is part of the ways that interest groups try to influence policy, is they hire lobbyists who could then go and speak on behalf of the interest group, try to convince legislators to enact policy that would be favorable to their members. Okay, let me see if there was anything else in here I really wanted to talk about before I pop over to the... Okay, good. I'm going to pop over to your review packet and just go through a couple things, okay? So I'll start here where it kind of compares political parties and interest groups. Just a note that I made about each one. Remember, political parties are much more focused on running candidates for office and getting them elected. And that's how they're trying to link citizens to the policymaking process, is generally by trying to get candidates elected who would then be able to enact policy and so on once they're in office. Whereas, again, interest groups are more focused on influencing those people who are already in office, right? And they do that through things like lobbying. They can do it with the courts through amicus curiae briefs. You might remember that from the judicial branch unit a little bit ago. Okay, so political parties, they pick candidates, they run campaigns, they give cues to voters, they educate voters and office holders, whereas you can see interest groups are much more, kind of policy driven, right? They articulate and coordinate policy, they draft legislation, they write up legislation and give it to the Congress people, and they try to mobilize their membership to apply pressure on legislators and government agencies. Okay, now I put a couple stars next to these ones on interest groups, next to giving cues to voters and educating voters and office holders, because those are things that weren't necessarily traditional, roles of interest groups, but in recent years it seems that they've taken this on a little bit more and more Okay, so you'll often see them do things like hand out report cards for legislators, or endorse certain candidates that they think would best represent their interests. So those are, they of course are not running the primaries or anything, though. They don't have the convention to nominate, someone for office. That's what political parties do. But interest groups are maybe a little bit more behind the scenes, trying to let their members know which people would be best for what they want. Okay, so I put down here too, interest groups are less regulated. Okay, they're more grassroots. They have a homogeneous membership, right? Interest groups are usually smaller memberships that are focused around, an issue or two. Whereas, remember, political parties, they try to just broaden their coalition as much as possible and bring in as many people as they can. So they're focused on many issues. This is a little review of the Iron Triangle that we would have learned about a little bit later. Remember, this is just that mutually beneficial relationship between an agency of the bureaucracy, an interest group, and a congressional committee, or staffs within Congress. Okay, so I'm not going to read through every single one, but those are the descriptions that show how each of these kind of work with each other. I would suggest taking a few minutes to make sure you kind of read back through that. Don't just write it down and run through. Okay, interest groups' influence on policy. Okay, so we're just going to talk about a few basic things here. Okay, so inequality of political and economic resources. So some groups have more resources. Okay, they have more membership. They have more money. They have a stronger and more passionate membership base. And if they have more resources, then that, of course, is going to allow them to be more influential in influencing policy. Okay, and it's going to give them a stronger chance, a stronger opportunity to actually, get those policymakers to enact policy that will benefit their group. Okay, and we're gonna use some good examples. I'm gonna give you an article. We're gonna talk about different examples that make sense with this. That you'll see kind of what we mean in real life. Unequal access to decision makers. So some interest groups might have a much stronger revolving door, we call it. Okay, so what the revolving door refers to is when former government officials, once they leave, the capital, they become lobbyists for an interest group with who they formerly dealt with in their government job. Okay, so they leave the congressional office, and it could be a congressperson. Generally, we're talking more of like their staff and whatnot. But then they go and become a lobbyist for a group that they would have worked with. And of course, those people, because they just left Congress, have a very strong relationship with other congresspeople and with other offices within, the House and the Senate. Okay, so they have a much easier access because they have those relationships built with policymakers. So, if you have that ability to hire former staffers and whatnot, you're going to probably have a better chance of getting policy that benefits your membership passed. The free rider problem. Okay, what the free rider problem refers to is basically if someone is not part of an interest group, but they still receive the benefits. That doesn't give them much incentive to join the group, right? So, they could just be sitting back and just be paying attention and be like, there's been a lot of legislation passed that, benefits, for example, I'll use the American Association of Retired Professionals, ARP, as an example. Okay, they represent, people 50 and older. So, they're of course very concerned about things like Social Security and whatnot. If I'm someone who's not a member of ARP, but I'm 65 years old, and I'm seeing that our legislators are continuing to, expand Medicare or expand Social Security, then I'm not going to have much incentive to join ARP because they're doing just fine. Okay, so without my membership, right? So you'll often see groups really try to offer incentives to people to try to avoid that free rider problem and get them to actually join. Single issue groups. Okay, so single issue groups are, and I use an example, something like the National Rifle Association, group that is formed around a very narrow interest. Okay, so one of the unique things about this is that often these single issue interest groups, they can, their membership base can be made up of a lot of people who don't traditionally, aren't traditionally involved in politics, right? So they might not really care about these different, policy issues, like whatever, healthcare or immigration or anything like that. They might not have a strong opinion on that, but if they have a strong opinion about, gun rights and whatnot, then they can join the National Rifle Association and feel like there's a group that speaks on their behalf. Ideological or social movements, and I threw down there, the NAACP. That's a great example to show, an interest group that it was very influential in a social movement, the civil rights movement, of course. If a social movement becomes popular, it could magnify the interest group's influence if they're associated with that movement, or the other way around if it's unpopular. Okay, so that could kind of, if it's on the right side of history, then that's going to be a good thing for the interest group's potential influence. The last one, protest movements, just saying, groups that bring attention to a social problem through public demonstrations or other forms of direct action. Of course, the whole point of that is that bringing attention will put pressure on the policymakers to try to do something. Okay, so it's just kind of a brief introduction into interest groups. We're gonna use some good examples. You're gonna read an article here in a little bit that kind of goes through that. Generally how they function, what they do to really try to influence policy. We'll learn a little bit about lobbying, and how how powerful that makes some interest groups. But we'll also see that it's not the end all be all. Okay, so there's different methods that interest groups use, but ultimately, they've become tremendously influential, which you can look at as a positive or a negative thing. Okay, there's definitely pros and cons here. Some of the negative views would say that special interests have become way too powerful in America, and it kind of disproportionately represents a small amount of members in this specific group. But other people would say, well, this is just another chance for us to, participate in the policymaking process, and be linked to our government officials. And it's not based on geography like Congress is. So there's a lot of pros and cons, positive and negative views that we'll go over before we finish up too. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction. We'll get into some other videos and whatnot that delve a little bit deeper. All right.